Hello and welcome to a fresh episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. And we have a very special guest this week. Galen, would you like to introduce our special guest?
Yeah, my good friend Andrew Leber is here. Thank you so much for joining us, taking the time. Andrew has a PhD from Harvard in government. He is now an assistant professor of political science at Tulane University. And most importantly, for my purposes, longstanding friend going back to our days when we were both learning Arabic in Egypt together. So pretty awesome to have you today, man.
Hey, all, thanks for having me on.
We're excited. Our plan is just to ask you a bunch of questions, and we're going to relate it to the stuff that we have talked about on the show recently. The Israel-Iran war seems like a pretty good place to start as far as that goes. How are the Gulf Emirates and Saudi Arabia positioning themselves in this conflict, given what's happened?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's kind of the paradigm for understanding relations across the Persian Gulf for kind of the past decade was the idea that it all revolved around a Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence. But that's flipped quite a bit in the past couple of years, not just the aftermath of the October 7th attack and the Israeli war in Gaza, but also even before that, Saudi Arabia and Iran had effectively normalized relations again, an agreement they signed in China. And by and large, the overriding priority for Saudi Arabia and to a lesser degree, the other Gulf states has been to stay out of the way of any fighting in the region. And that's held true for the recent fighting between Israel and Iran with, a bit of an assist from the United States there as well. And that Saudi Arabia, for the most part, certainly along with other Gulf states, put out strongly worded diplomatic statements, I think is the usual euphemism for it, kind of going back and forth in terms of first condemning Israel's attacks on Iran, then switching to condemn at the conclusion of that exchange, Iran's, I don't know what to call it, Iran's signaling attack on the Qatari airbase that hosts a lot of U.S. troops in Qatar. But in between, largely trying to stay out of the way of that conflict and avoid getting sucked in. Some of the other Gulf states like Qatar took kind of an approach of seeking refuge in the eye of the storm, if you will, and that Qatar wound up being sucked into that conflict in being targeted by Iranian missiles, but presented themselves in the aftermath as helping to broker the ceasefire arrangement that eventually came about. I'm a little bit skeptical that the Qatari leaders were wildly enthusiastic about being a target of Iranian missile strikes, but at least in the aftermath spun it as best they could and got, a congratulatory post from President Trump on Truth Social for their troubles and a nice write-up in CNN. So that worked out well enough.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome to have you here today. I should have said if you know more about the Gulf than just about anyone I know. So this is like perfect person to have to talk about this stuff with. If you could like flesh out a little bit what you were just talking about, if you think back to 2015 and the signing of the Iran nuclear deal, when the Saudis in particular were more or less totally aligned with the Israelis in really hating that agreement, and there was this counterbalancing coalition aimed against Iran. Would you say that those days have by and large come to an end now because the Israelis have largely wiped the floor with the Iranians for the past year and a half or so, and that the Gulf states are taking a more balanced position between Iran and Israel now?
Yeah, I would say almost, if we think of like the pendulum swinging back from a position of quasi-alignment with Israel, antagonism towards Iran, pendulum has kind of swung halfway back and then stopped in that I think Saudi Arabia and even to a lesser extent, the UAE have wound up in a place where they're relatively comfortable sort of being like somewhat normal relations with Iran, but not exactly like joining the Iranian camp against Israel. I mean, so yeah, if we go back a decade now, yeah, in the aftermath of the Iranian nuclear deal, the Gulf states, along with Israel, spent many subsequent years joining in the lobbying to try and tank that deal. But then the Gulf states, much more than Israel, had to deal with the fact that after Trump finally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, one of the main ways that Iran sought to push back against the subsequent campaign of maximum pressure was to put pressure back, not just on the United States, but on Saudi oil facilities and tankers seeking to dock in the United Arab Emirates. And their experience of that was that they were largely left by the Trump administration to deal with the consequences, the occasional assassination of an Iranian military leader aside. There was maybe some hope that, oh, okay, maybe the Biden administration will, I don't know, do something different or continue that policy. But especially once it became clear that the Biden administration was not exactly interested in restarting the Cold War with Iran, that was a major contributing factor in signing this renormalization deal with Iran. And if you kind of take a couple steps back towards, a multi-decade view, this pattern has repeated itself again and again since at least the 1980s in terms of there being a bit warmer relations in sort of, I think, the 90s and again in the 2000s, alternating with periods of more intense conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But definitely it leaves them sort of in a strange position now after Israel's attack on Iran, in that on the one hand, the threat posed by Iran is largely gone. Like, there was at least one Saudi commentator who was like, I don't know, political science professor at King Saudi University was writing like, wow, we played up this, he was writing in the Sharq al-Awsat, well, we played up this threat for so long, but clearly this was a paper tiger, and the threat that we thought Iran posed probably got exaggerated, and we should recognize that. But that doesn't require them to either side with Iran against Israel now, nor does it kind of removes a lot of the motivation to align more openly with Israel.
That makes sense. Would you say that assertion that Iran is no longer a threat is well-founded, though? Because we still have the Houthis in Yemen. Maybe they don't cause problems for the Gulf states. They're really more aimed at Israel and outside powers. But Iran, I think, classically has been known for interfering in internal affairs in this area and stirring up the Shia and things like that. Have they just stopped doing all of that?
Yeah, so I think it's probably an exaggeration to say that like Iran poses no threat into the region now, but certainly not. There's less of a sense of sort of existential encirclement from Iran and much more of a concern of sort of, I don't know, there's almost been an increasing way in which Israel has talked about using the exact same rhetoric that Iran was talked about as sort of an interventionist, revisionist power controlled by religious zealots. And increasingly, that's the way it's viewed, that, okay, the Houthis are still very much a concern. And that's a major reason why, I don't think we're going to see the Saudi government or even maybe the Emirati government sort of openly siding with Israel against Iran, whatever their private views of the war might be. But by the same token, sort of we're now in a place where instead of Syria being a battlefield in which an Iranian-backed regime is fighting against sort of encircled, Sunni-aligned rebels, we now have a situation in which there is at least, Western open, Sunni majority government that is open to a more multicultural Syria that is nevertheless having to contend with constant military interference from Israel. So I think, the sort of the continued concern about the danger that the Houthi forces pose to Saudi Arabia is a real concern. I think part of the reason that Saudi Arabia has stayed on the sidelines for this conflict is the concern that not like Houthi ballistic missiles have reduced in range at all, and a lot of the major economic projects in Saudi Arabia that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is pursuing remain in range of those missiles. And you would certainly not like to give Houthi forces any particular reason to use them on Saudi territory. But there's sort of this, it's like the opposite of, the strategy of the United States in the 1990s with dual containment, the idea the United States could hold back both Iraq and Iran and didn't need to align with either. It's the inverse of whatever that would be. And this kind of dual standoffishness, there's kind of tacitly okay relations with Iran, but we're not going to really do too much on Iran's behalf. This kind of under the table signaling openness to Israel. We're not going to do anything too overtly against Israeli interests, but at the same time, we're not going to take any public steps to align with Israel in the region.
That makes perfect sense. And you're drawing the analogy of the symmetry between right-wing religious extremists governing Iranian policy and right-wing religious extremists governing Israeli policy. That's a great way of putting it. That makes perfect sense. Like, oh, these guys aren't actually any different at this point. Go ahead,
Just
Galen.
to be clear, that's what sort of Saudi commentators are increasingly positioning it as, and that's not necessarily how the royal court would view it, but it's certainly kind of the framing or the spin that's being put on Israeli actions in the region. That they're now the sort of interventionist, destabilizing power in the region, much more so than Iran is.
Yeah, and that's maybe as a consequence of just their level of success, right? I'm sure Iran would prefer to be doing what Israel's doing, but yeah, hasn't gone very well.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the normalization agreement in 2023, you mentioned that China basically brokered the key provision in that the Saudis got was that the Houthis would stop, or that conflict in Yemen would basically be on hold, and at least when it comes to targeting Saudi Arabia, that détente ceasefire, whatever you want to call it, has largely held. I mean, the question I think a lot of us have these days, and I was quite surprised to learn, if the New York Times is to be believed in its reporting that came out about last week, which we all kind of circulated on text, that the idea of a Israeli-Saudi normalization agreement was still potentially alive as late as April 2024. That is 6 months after the Hamas attack of October 7th ushered in this new era for the Middle East. Do you think there is any chance that could still happen, or do you take the stated Saudi position to be representative of their real view, which is absent tangible steps toward the creation of an independent Palestinian state, that normalization process is on indefinite hold?
Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia benefits quite a bit from productive ambiguity in this area. It always tends to be phrased as like Saudi Arabia demands like a serious pathway towards the creation of a Palestinian state. And depending on what year we're in, the emphasis in that demand falls either on Palestinian state or serious pathway or just pathway.
Right.
So in the run up to October 7th, I don't want to overplay this in sort of directly precipitating Hamas's attack on that day, but certainly there was a clear gearing up in Saudi Arabia to prepare public opinion for negotiations. MBS acknowledged at least some form of Saudi engagement with these negotiations. Saudi officials still tell you in private, like, look, it's not off the table. Like, eventually, long term, this makes sense for the region. If you want to build and grow your economy, having the advanced industrial economy of the region fully walled off doesn't make a ton of sense. But I do think that there was like, for a few months after the October 7th attacks, and even in the first few months of Israel's sort of recently devastating response to that attack, there was still an opening where if Israeli leaders had said, like, sure, like, here's our 27-step pathway towards a Palestinian state, we'll take steps 1 through 2, maybe that could have opened the door again. And the challenge with assessing this stuff is that the kind of Saudi officials who speak to the kind of people who write about this stuff for newspapers or analyze this stuff for think tanks, and just to note, I'm a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, but like no views expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of my employer, or whatever I should say at this point. I do think that, I don't know, people can just get spun by this because in private, they'll be assured like, no, we're really still serious. We just have to say this because of, domestic public outrage or how this looks in the region. But you can kind of see in the public statements how the wiggle room has reduced over time. Like initially the statements like, oh, we condemn this really needs to end. There needs to be a pathway towards a Palestinian state. Then you get domestic commentators saying like, well, gosh, like if there isn't actually a Palestinian state, what's to stop this all happening again? And then you reach the point where the crown prince himself is openly labeling this like a crime against humanity and genocide, which is a pretty strong commitment to then back down from. I'm sure they could find a way if and when it came to it, but so long as the war, whatever we want to call the basically killing in Gaza at this point continues, it's going to be pretty hard for this, like not just like difficult, but like there's not much, I don't know, not much value added for the Saudi government to pursue normalization. Sort of they get tacit security coordination. It's not like the Israeli government needs more encouragement to damage Iranian military infrastructure in Iran or elsewhere. And I think the Saudi government gets most of the political benefits they get from normalization from just signaling that they're open to normalization. Like, I don't think in private they're ever going to say, like, ideologically, we can now never normalize with Israel. Like, it's back to 1973. But I don't know, kind of the glib way I've referred to it is the idea of like always be normalizing. Like for Saudi Arabia, there's always benefits and just always being like, we're, just around the corner, like we're thinking about it. They get kind of the benefit of the doubt that comes with being open to the idea from politicians and policymakers, not wanting to like push them too far. I think we saw even at Trump's visit in May, where he kind of openly referred to the fact that like, Saudi Arabia doesn't seem ready to normalize or expand the Abraham Accords yet, but that's fine. I'm sure you'll get around to it eventually. No need to rush on these things. So that's sort of where I think things stand right now.
That makes sense.
I'm glad we were able to work in a sort of Glengarry, Glen Ross reference there, always be normalizing. Yeah. I think all of us would love to see a peaceful Middle East with normalized relations between every country in the area. But unfortunately, we live in the real world. If I were the Saudis, I mean, going off what you said before, that the incentives to do this have in some ways shifted now that Iran has been given a bloody nose for the past year and a half. It's unclear to me what the Saudis get out of that deal, since they have less to worry about with respect to Iran. It would seem to be now, is the United States in a position to buy their normalization through security guarantees and help with their civilian nuclear program? So yeah, I think you're right that at least for the moment that's on indefinite hold, but I have to say I've been surprised by how quickly things have moved in the Gulf overall in the direction of warming relations between Israel and some of the Gulf states in the past, call it 15 years. Who knows, maybe as part of Vision 2030, we'll see that agreement down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's elements of it that you can see are kind of like if you obsessively follow domestic Saudi media, which I don't really recommend for anyone aside from me, I guess. I mean,
that's why we have you here, man. So you can tell us about.
I mean, for years leading up to 2023, you would see these sort of narratives being seeded, like, what have the Palestinians ever done for us? The kingdom has done so much for the Palestinian cause, and what do we get from it? These Palestinian influencers on Instagram keep like trash talking the kingdom, and it wasn't just fully propaganda. Like even in sort of like you would go to in-person meetings and people would raise this in private. There's still people who were like strongly committed to the Palestinian cause as well, but these ideas were kind of put out into the public for quite a while. Maybe dialed up and dialed back, but especially in 2023, they were really getting ramped up. Like this is one commentator, Abdul Rashid, who was writing like, actually bilateral agreements have been the way forward for the Middle East for some time, all but praising Sadat's normalization of ties with Israel as like securing the national interest of Egypt. And that was like, I don't know, July, August, 2023. And then by the end of 2023, he was saying like, oh, it's time to drag out the Arab Peace Initiative again. Clearly Saudi Arabia had the right idea in the early 2000s. It's time to bring that back. I think that, like Saudi, like Prince Mohammed wants to keep his options open. He's building this like fantasy city, or maybe not. I don't know. Reports vary of Neom, like in the part of Saudi Arabia that's right next to Israel, which doesn't make a ton of sense unless you eventually think that there's going to be some kind of, I don't know, economic hub that runs through Israel and to the Mediterranean, which is kind of what the Biden administration put forward as the U.S. response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. But also there's enough going on domestically in Saudi Arabia that there's nothing like forcing MBS or other Gulf leaders to really pursue this. And the October 7th war is kind of upended things, because prior to that, the sense was like, oh, like the United Arab Emirates really like stole a march on things. They've normalized with Israel. They kind of locked in all the stuff. And Saudi Arabia is kind of figuring out what they can get to kind of join the initiative as well before, the Palestinian issue no longer had much geopolitical value. But now I think kind of Saudi leaders are breathing a little bit easier, knowing like, okay, well, we still have this, card to play, as opposed to the United Arab Emirates, who just kind of like stuck with it. They're not going to suspend relations again because they benefit from it, but there's not much they can do other than clamp down domestically on discussing Palestine at all.
Yeah, I'd like to double click on that because, like, classically, where the rubber hits the road as far as this stuff goes is the Arab street.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on in the Arab street and Arab public opinion in these places. And I'm interested, first of all, in just what public opinion is on this topic, Israel, normalization with Israel, given the events in Gaza, the ongoing events in Gaza, versus however people feel about Iran. And kind of the balance there, number one. And then number two, how relevant that is to these monarchies, absolute monarchies.
Yeah, it was wild. So in May, I went to Jordan, the Sultan of Oman, and Saudi Arabia. And it was wild, the difference between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, in that, like Jordan, you practically don't see Western products anywhere. Like Western stores are empty. There's a full-on boycott going. They've replaced Coca-Cola and Pepsi with something called Matrix Cola that I didn't try, but is apparently, I don't know, tastes very. And that's also the case in Qatar, from what I've heard, in that Qatar has aligned itself politically pretty closely with the Palestinian cause, has taken a range of positions over the years. But you get a similar sort of openness for people to express how they feel, almost to the point of kind of cajoling people into making sure that they, boycott Western products or whatnot. But then on the other hand, you go to Saudi Arabia, and a friend would tell me like, oh yeah, like I tried to get on the metro. The Saudi friend just wearing a shirt that said Palestine, not like Palestine slogan, and was told by security at the metro, like, you can't get on the metro today, sir. Like, they were just wearing something else. There's no Palestinian flags, no nothing. But I don't think that's because everybody doesn't care. I think it's because there are consequences if you talk about it too openly. And, so you can talk about it in online spaces and in newspaper columns. And I think prior to 2023, or when I was going to Saudi Arabia more prior to the COVID pandemic, you would see a lot more framing of, the national interest of this fight against Iran means that we have to be concerned much more about national interest, geopolitics, and the Palestinian cause is just kind of not an issue anymore. That you don't really see so much of anymore. There's more of a sense of well, it's not we're going to jump on the bandwagon with Iran at this point, but also this sense of what Israel is doing is terrific. I don't know how exactly public opinion comes down to this in terms of how relevant it is to everyday life. But I know that this is stuff that people consume on social media constantly. There's no way to censor all of this stuff. All of the Gulf uses Western social media platforms where even if they've suppressed some of this stuff, they're also all on TikTok as well. So videos of what's happening in Gaza are circulating constantly. I'm an Omani diplomat friend who just constantly sends me WhatsApp messages. But since October 7th, all of the messages have been hypocrisy of America, awful images out of Gaza. So I think there really is a sense, especially from governments, that not that they're going to really stoke those feelings, but they have to stay one step ahead of them or out in front. For a while, again, Saudi Arabia tried to get, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, kind of the messaging from Saudi Arabia was, well, we need to focus on the domestic economy and other things. But then you've seen them take increasingly, even if it's not they're going to do anything materially against Israel, at least the sense that they have to make harsh diplomatic statements to kind of distance themselves from what's going on. And a clear sense that they, Saudi leaders and really no leaders in the Gulf want to be affiliated or associated in any way with what's going on. Sometimes you hear talk of oh, well, maybe they would get involved in the reconstruction of Gaza. But even then, I don't really think they want to have the Saudi name associated with things, especially if it's all just going to get blown up again in a year or two.
Huh. Yeah, makes sense.
One last point on that is it's also just really hard to gauge public opinion, given that even when there is some public opinion polling that goes on, but it's also hard to interpret. So for a while, there was polling that showed increased support for some degree of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and polling that I think the Washington Institute did. Then after October 7th, that support vanished and was back down to what it had been before. But So it's hard to interpret. Is that like people actually changing their minds, or is it just that like people no longer feel like, oh, the government wants me to say this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like it's just kind of hard to know based on the data or lack thereof, but I'm not going to say that it's a flip of what one might expect just because Jordan obviously has a large Palestinian population. But, Jordan's had a peace treaty with Israel for more than 3 decades. And I don't know, maybe it hasn't been the warmest of pieces, but in the past, I always felt that public opinion in the Gulf tended to be more strongly aligned with the Palestinian cause. So I guess it's unclear whether that shifted or not, or whether we just don't know because of the lack of access to reliable data.
Galen, like Jordan has assisted Israel like recently in like the security sphere, shooting down missiles from the territory and things like that. In addition, Jordan is, more than half Palestinian at this
Yeah,
point.
there's always this difference between the official level and public opinion with some of this stuff. So, but it's just interesting to hear that there seems to have been somewhat of a shift, at least in how the different states in the area are looking at things. I want to ask you some domestic questions about a few of these places. Before I do
Mhm.
that, one more question, just because, I do this for a living and I think this can get kind of confusing. So I guess I'm going to do the academic thing and try to bury two questions in one. But like, what would you say the vision of people like MBS and Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ in the UAE, like, what would they like to see in the Middle East? Like, what are their priorities? What are their economic and geopolitical goals? And then the part that I think trips people up sometimes is there's sometimes some pretty clear divisions with Qatar. So if you could unpack what those divisions are a bit as well.
Yeah, my sense is it's a little bit different for different countries. So I think for Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, the goal is to ensure that the UAE kind of, as a hackneyed phrase, but kind of like punches above its weight in terms of geopolitical heft to ensure that the hydrocarbon wealth of the country gets plowed into new industries that are going to augment the existing oil wealth and sustain the country, into a increasingly distant post-oil future. There's also a sense of like wanting, the military heft and the security sort of partnerships, alliances, whatever you want to call it, to ensure that the UAE doesn't need to worry for its own security as much and sort of stays on the good side of a range of different powers. So on the one hand, you have a lot of overtures to the United States to ensure that that relationship remains good, but also pretty close ties to China. And also a pretty profitable, good relationship with Russia, and that tons of Russian wealth are now being funneled through Dubai. I think it's also a vision in which sort of popular individual level politics don't exist, in which elites manage the country and elites manage relationships, and in which kind of, I don't know, political causes no longer have the potential to mobilize people outside of the national borders. So you've seen this. The clearest example of this is in cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements, partly because ideologically, I don't think Mohammed bin Zayed likes their vision of what the world would be. But I think also just he doesn't want any outside power that can mobilize anybody to tell him what to do. I think Mohammed bin Salman shares that view to a similar degree. Clearly, Mohammed bin Zayed's vision rubbed off on him a bit, like they spent a lot of time together socially. But of course, I think Mohammed bin Salman's vision is that Saudi Arabia is in the driver's seat much more than the UAE. And
Sure.
especially as Iran has kind of diminished as a major antagonist in the kind of Saudi view, there's been much more competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And also as competition with Qatar has diminished. So Qatar are much more in the camp of just trying to maintain its autonomy as the country with the smallest citizen population among the GCC countries, as like a kind of physically quite small country that has historically relied at least on the impression of outside ties to maintain its autonomy. But there have been ideological disputes over Qatar trying to build up ties with Islamist movements as a way to influence politics beyond its borders. That sort of difference between, so, I don't know, going back how many years ago, 8 years ago, there was a huge diplomatic dispute between Qatar United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia at the time. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, much more aligned in trying to contain what they saw, or at least presented as Qatari meddling in the region. That dispute largely resolved in early 2021. And since then, economic competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia has come to the fore much more. But anyway, I've gone on for a while on that. But with Mohammed bin Salman, a lot of similarities with Mohammed bin Zayed in terms of wanting to diminish the appeal of transnational political movements. So the Palestinian cause is not something he wants to, I don't know, defuse just as a way of normalizing with Israel, but just as sort of any issue that could potentially mobilize a significant portion of the population. And also a future in which Saudi Arabia is not just kind of a oil-rich country, which it is and will remain, but also a country that is built into strategic economic sectors the way Taiwan is built into semiconductor production. I guess one last point that I've been kind of going on in my own analysis for a bit is that a major difference though between the UAE and Saudi Arabia is that it's just like kind of a basic point, but Saudi Arabia is like a big country with a large citizen population. So it has to find jobs for its citizens in the way that the United Arab Emirates really doesn't. The United Arab Emirates wants to set up a new economic sector like in, I don't know, AI hub. They can just pay a bunch of people from Europe and the United States to come in, and then they can always just give their citizens jobs along that. I'm sure that, there are plenty of talented Emiratis who could work there as well. Whereas like Saudi Arabia, you're figuring, okay, I've got to like find something that's going to generate jobs for like tens of thousands of people coming onto the job market each year.
But so just to kind of put a bow on this, it sounds like, what they all kind of want is a stable region where they can grow their respective countries economically, and that might lead to some economic competition, and maybe the methods of competition vary. You mentioned some ideological differences, but for the most part, this is largely for all three of those countries about regime stability and keeping out transnational ideologies that could threaten that, so that they can, in the meantime, continue their upward economic trajectories.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary for it. And then kind of on the one hand, I think they would all prefer a situation in which there were some kind of two-state solution, so they could just not worry about conflicts with Israel, in which Israel was not intervening in regional countries, Iran was not intervening in regional countries, and they could just pursue. I'm sure they'd be pursuing other things as well, but it doesn't seem like they have either a plan or the intention of bringing that regional peace about beyond sort of periodic, I don't know, like one-off mediation efforts when in a kind of opportunistic manner.
Yeah, and my sense with that is, like, you go back, since you mentioned 1973 already, you go back to that time and King Faisal is in charge. My sense is that, with some exceptions, maybe Fahad would be an exception, Saudi rulers actually at a personal level were very concerned about the Palestinian issue. It does not seem like that is the case for MBS, and it's more of a, sure, I'd like to get this out of the way because it causes me problems in certain areas and can be a kind of pain in my ass and an obstacle, but that at a personal level, things have maybe shifted in that regard.
Yeah, the way it was explained occasionally in Saudi Arabia to me, it was like his dad's like, or the extent, his questions about how together King Salman is mentally these days, but to the extent he's sort of on the ball still, he's very much down with the Palestinian cause still, was like the person in charge of collecting donations for the Palestinian cause in Riyadh back in the 70s and beyond. And, this guy, you never know if this is the way it would have actually worked. It was always felt to me like, oh, like as long as he's alive, no normalization, because regardless of what his mental state is, he would probably notice. But then when he's gone, it's going to happen. But, now I don't think MBS has any personal commitment to the Palestinian cause, but now like scheming to throw his lot in with the Israeli government or anything like the present Israeli government is just way more trouble than it's worth for him.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to go back to sort of the strategic investments that these countries are making and ask you two questions about them. One is whether like those investments are like self-consciously part of a longer term strategy? I know that Saudi Arabia has Vision 2030, right?
Mhm.
Which extends 5 years from now. And they've talked about further investments beyond that. Does this amount to kind of the type of program that you see like promulgated by the Chinese Communist Party? Sort of like a very, very deep, long-term, careful plan to dominate the industries of the future. And obviously, these countries don't have the wherewithal to do that necessarily, but they do have a lot of resources.
Mhm.
And I know that they're taking steps to seemingly be strategic, not just in technical areas, but also in cultural areas, acquiring sports teams, game developers, and so on. That's number one. Number two, do you think it's going to work, given everything you know about these places?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. On the first one, I mean, the problem with assessing this stuff is that there's a lot of different things mixed together at the same time. And then it's sort of easy to pick specific things and be like, this is ridiculous. And it's also easy to pick things, especially if you're a consultant making a lot of money off of picking things like this and being like, this is a great strategic investment. You should really do this. So there's certainly a lot of statishness over time in terms of what Vision 2030 concentrates on. There's like a huge investment in the live golf and like the professional golfing circuit. Golf is like not a widely practiced sport in Saudi Arabia outside of the
It's
kind
all
of people.
sand traps.
Yeah. Well, if you pour enough water onto the sand traps, eventually you can get grass. But it's the kind of thing where it's like something like that. You're like, okay, the preferred sport of the kind of people who manage the kingdom's investments happens to be a strategically important investment. Is like, okay, I mean, there's like the narrative of sports washing. Like, which I'm sure exercises some effect, but I don't know if like Phil Mickelson was ever going to be like the premier critic of like absolute monarchy.
I think we know from leaked phone calls that he was not.
Yeah. We know where Phil stands on this stuff, but but I do think there is like, so I think if you talk to people who manage this stuff in Saudi Arabia, there'll be like some handwriting and being like, yeah, look, there's some ridiculous stuff that's never going to plan out, but focus on kind of the more strategic things in the long term. I think so it can be hard to sip like what is really, intentional and is going to work out from the stuff that's like, the neighboring country is doing it, so let's do it too. So like with the AI investments that have gotten a lot of press coverage recently, and that I'm thinking of looking into a bit more, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia got some kind of chips deal off of Trump's visit. Both of them have some kind of state-owned firm that's getting involved in things. Both of them get talked about in news articles as like the Gulf states that are pursuing AI. But the Emirati investment in that is way out of proportion to what Saudi Arabia is doing. Like the amount of chips they're talking about bringing in, the amount of infrastructure they've already built up around an AI ecosystem versus like, I mean, Saudi Arabia has like some stuff going, but it's just not there to the same extent. But I do think you can see areas where they are investing pretty strategically. Like it makes a lot of sense for them to move into the media sector much more. There's like a lot of film production. There's always been a fair amount of like media and other television presence. They're trying to Saudi Arabia is trying to capture market share in the Arabic media market. And yeah, if you've got a lot of like well-educated, creative young people who want to work on these projects, and that can be like a major export in the form of soft power influence, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know, however, how much this is like, we have the set in stone plan and we're never going to change it. Like I doubt AI investments were on the menu and or sort of on the agenda in Saudi Arabia 5 years ago, beyond some broad sense they're investing in financial technology. And if you go back to the start of the Vision 2030 plan, it started out as something very different. It started out as like, okay, we're going to do financial austerity combined with selling off Aramco and use the proceeds from Aramco to like do industrialization. And then they found other ways of getting the money anyway. But so this stuff kind of evolves over time. And, the 2030 deadline, they've already said there's going to be like, well, we'll just, we'll announce another plan. I mean, other countries in the Gulf do this too. Like Oman had a Vision 2020 and then they just updated it to Vision 2040. And we're like, yeah, we're still working on it. So, there's always more time.
Like a big part of this, at least as it's discussed publicly, is weaning Saudi Arabia in particular off of hydrocarbons as its main source of economic growth and productivity.
Mm.
Do you think that is in fact happening? Are they trying to diversify away from oil? Like how big are these investments? Do you have a sense of whether oil is still at the heart of their economic strategy or like
Yeah, I think so. Sorry to go back to Steve's earlier question because I didn't answer the part about like, do I think it'll work? I mean,
oh, my
I
fault.
oh yeah, no, I guess I should answer that. I mean, it's hard for me to know. So back in 2016, an economic consulting work from the Gulf, like back when Vision 2030 was announced, was like if they achieve 4% of what they're saying, I guess it's a success because at least it's done something. And then I think they definitely succeeded more than 4%. I mean, Saudi Arabia is kind of unrecognizable from what it was like 7, 8 years ago in terms of the
Totally.
social transformation. Like 8 years ago, McDonald's would have like a cinder block wall down the middle because like all single men should be on one side and families and any women on the other. Now there's like plenty of cafes all over the place in Riyadh where it's like mixed gender company of people hanging out, smoking shisha, like playing cards or something. Just the social environment has changed quite a bit. That opens up a lot of new economic opportunities that just didn't exist before because it's hard to attract international tourists when the built architecture and the like day-to-day social life are very hostile to outsiders. The individual Saudis, of course, very hospitable, but like the religious beliefs probably less so. So, but I think kind of the longer term success though is like, they succeeded in making a country, getting the economy to run much more efficiently and to generate a lot more non-oil activity off of existing oil well. But the economic cycles still run on the underlying oil well. So it's not a surprise that they've announced a ton of these Saudi Arabia's announced a ton of these new mega projects in recent years as oil prices jack back up after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because there's the money to do this. And now as the prices are kind of wavering a little bit, every time I go to Saudi Arabia, there's like a different project that's being quietly plowed under so they can recoup the cash to put it somewhere else. And they're trying to restrict the spending a bit. So they've smoothed out the boom and bust cycles a bit, but the oil is still driving this. And you can kind of see this in stuff that doesn't get as much attention now because of all the bells and whistles going on in Riyadh. Like if you look at Saudi Arabia's engagement in climate negotiations, it's still following the pattern of throwing a lot of weight around in these negotiations to make sure that we don't criticize hydrocarbon burning too much, saying like, oh, we need to ensure the developing world still has access to cheap oil wealth, sort of ensuring that the underlying oil economy still chugs along. Like, the outset in 2016, MBS said we're going to be off oil by 2020. And like that part of the speech doesn't get brought up all that much in Saudi Arabia anymore, because I don't think it's going to happen. And it's much harder to imagine for a country like Saudi Arabia than a country like the United Arab Emirates, where the United Arab Emirates still has an enormous amount of oil wealth, but on a per capita basis, the money that they've stockpiled is just much greater than Saudi Arabia. Even if we're talking like relatively equal amounts of capital, you could I don't know if this is that technically feasible, but like in theory, you could just live off the returns on that for most Emiratis and guarantee a decent standard of living, which is just not possible in Saudi Arabia. You've got a population of many millions that you need to find some kind of relatively labor intensive industry for, or you need to get the education system up to the point where ordinary Saudis can, find what they consider to be good jobs in the private sector.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's this idea of like the Emiratis just chilling and like just not having jobs. It's kind of hilarious, but that is where they're at. Saudi is still growing pretty fast. It's my understanding.
Yeah, it's the population still keeps expanding. There's certainly an expatriate population in both countries, but Saudi Arabia has basically put as much, like the Saudi government, especially since the Arab Spring, has put as much pressure as it can on the private sector to hire more Saudis. You talk to any kind of private sector employer in works and operates in Saudi Arabia. And a major concern is like, where am I going to get and retain enough Saudis to work on my projects or work for my company? And even with all that pressure, they're kind of still struggling to generate enough jobs. The Public Investment Fund, their major sovereign or their more activist sovereign wealth fund, has pivoted a lot of its activity from investing overseas to investing in a ton of different ventures at home, in the hopes that at least some of those are going to turn out to be both, I don't know, mass employers and also profit makers. But, whether that's successful remains to be seen.
I want to go back to something you said just a few minutes ago, which is this seeming transformation that has occurred within Saudi Arabia. In some ways, I started teaching this stuff at the worst possible moment because it felt completely overtaken by events from like the start of me teaching it in 2018. But like, can you describe a little bit more what that transformation looks like, where it's been real and where it still has limits? Because I think we all know that there are some deeply imperfect parts of Saudi governance and politics still. And what has been, other than MBS himself, like what has allowed that to happen? Has this been enabled by putting the ulama, the clerical establishment in its place? Have they kind of been massively weakened? Where has this all kind of stemmed from in the first place?
Yeah, well, it's been on kind of, I guess, a little bit of a boring point, but I think that like the narrative of like top-down transformation by MBS, like, there's obviously an element of truth to that, but I think that social change was underway in Saudi Arabia long before this. You had a pretty highly educated population. Wealthy Saudis spent time abroad. It wasn't like they had like no concept of the outside world. You had an enormous scholarship program under the previous King Abdullah that sent like hundreds of thousands of Saudis, and in many cases their families, to the United States, Europe, elsewhere to get an education, like with the express aim of exposing people to different ways of life and like culturally moderating people somewhat. So you have this big reserve of people who have a lot of skills and interests where there wasn't that much to do with it in the Saudi Arabia that existed 10 years ago in terms of the kind of economic activity that was being considered or the kind of interest people had. So I guess to take one kind of pithy example, you had a lot of Saudi, I don't know, like YouTube stars who would make these interesting either sketch comedy videos or music videos on YouTube and would get pretty popular and this get passed around, but it was hard to really monetize that in a country that banned cinemas and, did music concerts.
It was difficult.
Whereas now a lot of those people, have turned their kind of, I don't know, looser social media collectives into formal companies or making not just YouTube shorts, but feature length films, some of which, show up at international film festivals that get distributed inside the kingdom and don't do terribly and aren't themselves that bad. At least not all of them. Some of them are, but so in that sense, but kind of the fundamental thing, was Mohammed bin Salman realizing like that probably Saudi society, that on the balance, there were more people who would be down with the kind of country Saudi Arabia is now than the way it was 10 years ago. That not everybody would be happy with it, but that you could probably use the massive repressive might of the Saudi state to clamp down on the couple of people who would complain, rather than using that to keep things the way they were. So in a relatively short span of time, you had the religious police that used to roam around all parts of the kingdom. Their power was curtailed in a lot of places. You had the steady lifting of a lot of restrictions on women's social and economic and just physical autonomy in terms of being able to like leave the country without a guardian's approval or even open a bank account without a guardian's approval. You had a lot of restrictions on social mixing in public, gradually eased and then eliminated altogether. Infamous ban on women driving lifted in 2018, which had been campaigned for by many Saudi activists for a long time. So you finally saw action on a lot of things that a lot of Saudi critics, sort of more courageous, knowledgeable than I had been calling for a long time. And it really has had an enormous effect in just what public life is like in the kingdom. And it feels very different to be in Riyadh now. Like, you used to think of Riyadh as like this very closed down space. And now it's like a major, I don't want to be like, I don't know, patronizing, but it's like a major Arab capital now. You go now and then you like realize, oh, I'm in a country, sorry, I'm in a city that's filled with like a lot of well-educated, highly productive and motivated like Saudis. And it's clearly like an Arab city, like with the majority of the population being Arab in a way that like a lot of the other Gulf cities where there's sizable expatriate populations, and just as well, just don't feel like that. So I think, yeah, a combination of pre-existing social change, top-down reform, and just it has also been accompanied, however, by like extraordinarily like new heights of repression, in the sense that even the very narrow ways that people used to be able to criticize the government have largely gone, or in some cases have been reinvented. Like you used to be able to write like op-ed columns that kind of critique particular ministers or push particular agendas within a very narrow boundary. That's largely gone by the wayside. Like one of the people who used to practice that art was a media figure named Jamal Khashoggi, who sort of was rather infamously murdered by agents of the Saudi state in 2018.
I've heard of that guy. Yeah.
Yeah. So that didn't really send a great signal for media freedom in the country. Large numbers of people were jailed for years, just in many cases for like the political equivalent of holding a book club, or in many cases for things they had like done years prior and had stopped doing out of fear that they would get jailed for it. Large numbers of people were released earlier this year, I guess in part because of an internal review that said that like partly the prisons were getting overcrowded, and also that like, this probably earned the crown prince some goodwill. But at the same time, like the Saudi government executed a journalist for like being critical of the government effectively. So all of this, the narrative from the Saudi government is like, oh, we need to be this harsh in order to like keep this social change on track. I've always felt that was, a little self-serving, to put it mildly, but that's been kind of the big change. Like 7 years ago, a Saudi friend put it to me like, oh, we're not like the United Arab Emirates. You can say what you want here and try, but, at least we can sort of think openly. And that's largely changed. Like people are not open. It's really affected sort of me doing my research. My sense is that like now it's much harder to do the kind of research I was once able to do in Saudi Arabia, at least in person. And people are just, people still talk, but they talk amongst themselves and are like much more careful about kind of who they speak with and what they say about the government, or just politics in general. It's also easier. I think the way I described this one was like the downsides for criticizing the government openly are much more down than they used to be. And also the upsides for kind of just demonstrating loyalty and going with the flow are much greater as well, because there are good jobs to be had with the government, whether directly or as a contractor. There's a lot of economic activity in the country. You can just kind of focus on making a good life for yourself and not worrying about all this other stuff too much.
It's really interesting to have a reformed government like so militantly suppressing free speech. It's a strange combination.
I was gonna say it's like a bit paradoxical that there seems to be a liberalization in cultural, social terms, economic terms, but moving hard toward repression in political terms.
And it generates some contradictions along the way. Like it almost winds up being like whack-a-mole. Like we've got people to like quiet down in this area, but it always kind of comes back around the other way. This is maybe someday I'll actually get this research published, but like kind of the challenge for the Saudi government is that they have to maintain some channel of communication, get people to listen to them, to try to convince them to like continue to be like okay with things. But anytime you do that, like no one wants to listen to a government minister drone on for an hour. So you have to find some way to get people to listen to that. So they've invested a lot recently in podcasts, or a media company closely affiliated with the royal family bought up like a podcasting collective called Themania. And then they've got a lot of podcasts. A lot of them are just kind of like cultural, like interesting cultural values, like fun discussions. But some of them are interviews with government ministers talking about like, oh, here's all the, the interesting stuff we're doing as part of Vision 2030. And that, that becomes a bit of a way to like, again, part of it is self-serving, but the podcast hosts occasionally are like, things haven't been going so great in this development authority, or like some people are critical of the way that these taxes were imposed. What do you say to that? Even like kind of the movies that I've seen from Saudi Arabia, some of them you can read depending, there's like a film I review called Night Courier, which like you look at it one way and you're like, yes, breaking the law brings bad consequences, whereas following the law will lead to a productive, gainful role in society. But you can also read it as like, wow, the socioeconomic changes that are happening are really crushing people underfoot and driving them to make like really bad decisions in life to try to get ahead or even maintain their kind of social standing. And that's a really stressful time to live through. And then even then there's like back and forth inside the Saudi government over that sometimes, like, not that I could name the factions, but clearly there are some people who are inside the monarchy who are whispering in Mohammed bin Salman's ear saying like, oh, it's good that we have these prestige films because people like that and, it makes us look good and then we can export these. And then there are people saying like these hipsters making podcasts and television shows are just like subversives who are undermining the authority of the state and they must be crushed. So yeah, I mean, so some of those people get jailed and then they get released, and some of them don't get released. So yeah, it's interesting to manage.
Yeah, that's what we do here. We do subversion.
Yeah.
That's our primary function.
Do you have anything else, Steve?
I don't think so. I think we can move to book corner. Perhaps
I had two more questions.
You had two more questions. Okay.
One. Well, I don't know if it's a small one, and then one just because I know Andrew will have lots of interesting things to say about it. Speaking of Saudi Arabia specifically, in foreign policy terms, what would you say is the government's number one concern that it deals with on a day-to-day basis? And then the second question is, I think it was Bruce Riedel wrote that book, Kings and Presidents, right around the time of all this transformation we were talking about.
Yeah.
But I think in his book, he said the ties that bind are the classic oil for security deal that go back all the way to World War II. And then the things that tend to pull the United States and Saudi Arabia apart are differences on human rights, democracy, Wahhabism, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm not sure how much the United States cares about democracy at this point itself. And certainly not the current administration when it comes to Saudi Arabia. We talked about Israel-Palestine and how that's, more on the back burner than it used to be, and all of this social transformation. On the other hand, given the shale revolution and concerns about climate change and all that, it seems like the thing that used to drive the countries apart have largely moderated, but the glue that held them together has also moderated. So I guess I'd just be interested in hearing your views on what you think the future trajectory of U.S.-Saudi relations would look like.
Yeah, I think in terms of the foreign policy objective right now, it's hard to define exactly, but I would say it's like just making money or sort of signing business deals that generate jobs and returns domestically, even to the point of when Saudi officials go to like investment forums overseas in the United States, like the thing they want to talk about is like how we're going to get jobs for Saudi citizens. It's like the priority in, it's not like they had full control over what went down during Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, but the focus was very much on like, we're going to secure these strategic economic ties with major US tech companies and get sanctions relief for Syria so that in the sense of like, okay, I mean, you could get Trump to go for that. And then he just sort of says, we're going to lift sanctions. And then which is a good thing to do. But, so I think I think finding a way to make money and provide jobs, and also without investing too much into it, trying to, intervene here and there to kind of tamp down on the regional conflicts that threaten to undermine that.
Okay.
In terms of the US-Saudi relationship in general, I think there is, I think a pivotal moment for Saudi Arabia was in the aftermath of various attacks on oil tankers and oil infrastructure, both on Saudi territory and in the Gulf, was the realization that
you're talking about 2019.
2019, Abqaiq, the attack on the Abqaiq oil facility. I think that just to, opine for a bit, I think there's been a tendency to come up with these hard and fast rules of the way the world works based on one instance people just fix in their brains. So the United States intervened to prevent Saddam from seizing control of Kuwait in 1990 to 1991. And that became this fixed sense of if there's an attack on Gulf oil infrastructure, then the United States will militarily intervene. And then it was okay, and it just didn't happen. So I think that was a major change in terms of realizing like, oh, that's not going to be like an automatic trigger of US security intervention. So certainly there's some degree of leverage there still in that, for as long as the assumption in the United States was like, well, oil prices don't really depend on like anything in a day-to-day basis, up to, I think, 2022, the thing was like, well, maybe that doesn't bind us to Saudi Arabia as much anymore. But I think you saw with President Biden that like the moment oil prices start rising in the United States and people start blaming that on the fact that he called Saudi Arabia a pariah, among other things, like Russia invading Ukraine, then that's when you see like the US government say like, okay, well, even if it's just the perception that somehow this has something to do with oil wealth, we still have to at least, go through the motions and figure out how to have a productive relationship. I do think that there are, like on the cultural front, there's clearly like far fewer barriers than there used to be. I mean, you see a very targeted effort from the Saudi government to, based on probably their understanding of what drives US politics, but you have a very public effort to like support, I want to say this very, very gingerly, but like Jewish American associations make a big sort of statement of like, oh, Saudi Arabia has nothing against Jews or the Jewish people, which has been like a big sticking point in the US-Saudi relationship for a long time. And you have a lot of efforts to present themselves the way the United Arab Emirates does. It's just kind of like open to all comers. Like there's no cultural barriers between Saudi Arabia and outsiders anymore. But you also see a sense of like trying to find something else that's going to tie Saudi Arabia to the United States again on top of any sort of energy oil connection. Like maybe AI infrastructure, chips production is going to do this for Saudi Arabia. I don't know how serious they are about it, but that's at least, I think, part of the thinking behind making that a center point of those, of Trump's visit back in May.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you for everything.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. Fantastic discussion. So we do a little book corner on this show, and we wanted to basically start with you and your book, Andrew. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah. 1 second, just trying to remember the name. Okay, I just trying to remember the name of the book that's relevant here. Yeah, so I guess to the extent that there's a working title, it's The Reformer's Dilemma, The Politics of Policymaking in Saudi Arabia, but it focuses a lot more on domestic politics in Saudi Arabia, given that what I do for the like ivory tower academic world is consider the like drivers of domestic policy decisions in authoritarian regimes, Saudi Arabia being one of them. And the focus is very much on the kind of policy ideas or ideologies that drive different policies to be adopted. So obviously that became a big thing with the Vision 2030 plan with Mohammed bin Salman, but the book kind of tries to go back to earlier periods of Saudi politics and say like, I don't know, I guess the political project on the Saudi side is to show that like, yes, there is something different, obviously, about the things that Mohammed bin Salman has done, but it's not like they're completely unique in the history of Saudi politics. And they build on decisions that have been taken by previous rulers for similar motivations. So I look at things like the Saudi government investing in the parts of the country that have not been historically favored. So like the capital city of Riyadh, a lot going on there. You go to like a southern region like Asir and like things have changed. Like there's fancier coffee shops these days, but a lot of stuff is kind of the same as it always has been. Looking at how they've dealt with the labor market, regulating the fact that they have a huge expatriate labor population, but also more Saudis who want to get jobs, and also on some of the social reform stuff. So you saw previous, it's like, I guess the counterpart to always be normalizing for Saudi Arabia was always be reforming. Like every single Saudi king is a reformer, like on something, I guess. But previously it was these ways of kind of sidestepping cultural opposition to some of these reforms. Like, okay, like nobody wants there to be gender mixing at Saudi. Well, I'm sure some people do, but like, we don't think we can get away with gender mixing at Saudi universities. We'll just send a bunch of people to the United States and they can like experience life in the United States there. And that's how we're going to sidestep that. So yeah, it's sort of focusing on obviously talking about what that looks like under MBS, but rolling it back in time to see what led up to it as well.
Yeah, it's sort of historical continuity. And of course, coffee is for reformers only. We know that.
Yeah. Really hitting that one.
Yeah.
You joke about that, but like actually it's become like a huge thing for like the Saudi government now is like, sorry, this is going to be an aside, but I promise there's a payout for this,
No,
which is
please.
that. So the like coffee growing region of Southern Arabia is largely in Yemen. Like Yemen is known for its coffee. The Yemeni port of Mocha is where we get the term mocha from.
I didn't know this. This is fascinating.
But a tiny part of that extends into Saudi Arabia. And like, I can't 100% back this up. So true, like the Saudi government don't sue me, but my sense from what I heard in Saudi Arabia was that it was originally a joint proposal by like the Yemeni government, which at the time was in exile in Saudi Arabia because of the Saudi-led military intervention to try to reverse the Houthi takeover of Sana'a. Anyway, that the Saudi government and the Yemeni government were both going to like put Arab coffee forward to UNESCO as like a UNESCO like cultural heritage thing. And but then along the way, the Saudi government, like as part of its drive to develop a greater national identity and a Saudi brand, told the Yemeni government that actually this would only be a Saudi proposal. So now there's like a big investment in Saudi coffee. Like there are some coffee farms in the South, and there's a government-backed firm called Jazeen, which is going to do like Saudi coffee. The main challenge is that they don't have a lot of production of coffee in Saudi Arabia. So I went to their flagship store in Riyadh. They have exactly one store, and most of the coffee they sell, does like contain Saudi coffee because like most of it is mixed in with other coffee because they can't produce enough. And there's like only one brand that's 100% Saudi coffee, which I have a bag of to use at some point. But anyway, that's the long Saudi nationalism coffee aside. So thanks for humoring me.
So, yeah, coffee,
that's good.
Very much a part of the reformer's dilemma.
Yeah. A lot of coffee. Yeah.
Steve, did you have a book?
I do. I feel, well, maybe I shouldn't close with it. Maybe you should close with yours. Mine is pretty depressing. It's a nuclear war scenario by Annie Jacobsen. Did you read that?
Yeah, but it's been it came out last year, 2 years ago?
Yeah, I'm a little late to the party. I'm glad that I read it. I think everybody should read it or listen to it, honestly, even though you're not going to like what you hear at all. And classically, when it comes to nuclear strategy, I'm somebody who's a little bit more on the laissez-faire side, Kenneth Waltz. Like, oh, it wouldn't be the worst thing. If everybody got nuclear weapons, it probably promotes stability. But like just going through the scenario in exacting detail, kicks off with a bolt from the blue from Mad King in North Korea, and goes into that and what that would look like and what happens next. And it ends 24,000 years later when North America is habitable again.
Yeah, maybe I should assign that when I'm doing like technical stuff on nukes, just the blast effects, somatic effects, genetic effects. It's like really grim stuff.
She's a hell of a writer when she goes into like all the dialogue between the Joint Chiefs and the president, the vice president, the acting president, and all this other stuff. And yeah, there's a number of poignant asides. And I learned a lot about like where PSYOP came from. For instance, I was not aware that every branch of the military had its own nuclear weapons and its own warfighting plan in the early Cold War. That's insane.
PSYOP, the single integrated operating plan, which back in the early 60s involved hundreds of targets in both the Soviet Union and China and would have led to hundreds of millions of casualties.
Absolutely. Yeah, spoiler alert, that's what ends up happening in this scenario. It also reminded me that we do have missile interceptors. I had actually forgotten about that. It's like, oh yeah, no, we have, was it Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and then in the Aleutians?
I've been right there. Vandenberg's not too far from where I grew up.
So. Yeah, they've got 4 interceptors there, another 40 in Alaska, and they won't do anything. So, but they're still there. We still have them. So,
I got to tell you, Andrew talking about the origins of the term mocha was a lot more
congenial. Yeah. Sorry about that. Awesome book, though. Awesome book.
It is.
Yeah.
I'll show it because I just read it. The most anticipated book we've ever had since I've been talking about it for 3 weeks. Our Dollar's Your Problem by Kenneth Rogoff.
Yeah.
Which comes from a quote from the Treasury Secretary in the Nixon administration, John Connally, who famously said when the United States went off the gold standard and ended Bretton Woods in 1971.
Unilaterally.
Yes, the Europeans were upset about what this would do to the value of their dollar reserves. And he famously said, our dollar, your problem. It's very timely to have read the book. I thought it was awesome. There's kind of 2 parts of the book. potential challengers to the dollar as the global reserve currency, which we've talked about on the show previously, and which largely supported what our other guest we've had on the show, Ryan Weldias, said, which was the challengers are not in a great position to overtake the dollar.
Right.
For a variety of reasons. He's much less of a bull on China, for example. But the second half of the book is about the U.S. side of the equation, and that part is a lot more upsetting, particularly since it was published before we just added $6 trillion to the national debt. And I won't go into too many of the details, but to keep it short, interest rates probably are not going to go down, at least in a sustained and major way, for quite a while. And that's probably for the best, unless we remove the recipe we've had for success economically, which is the independence of the Federal Reserve, which increasingly appears under threat, whether that
tenuous
is because Trump decides to somehow find a way to fire the chairman, Jerome Powell, or simply replace him with someone who will lower interest rates when his term is up next year.
Right. So we have actual nuclear war scenario and financial nuclear war.
So by comparison, Andrew, you really lightened the mood today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, like minor domestic economic reforms in Saudi Arabia over the past 20 years, they really seem fun in comparison. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're security studies guys primarily, so this show is often a bummer. It's great to hear about the port of Mocha in Yemen. I didn't know. Not just that, everything else you delved into was incredible. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for appearing on the show. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you back anytime.
Sure.
Okay. So that is the show.
All right.
Steve Galen and Professor Leber, we bid you adieu. Till next time.